A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Garden Beyond the Stone Wall. Before we begin tonight's story, make yourself comfortable. Perhaps pull a blanket a little closer, settle into your favorite pillow, and let the day slowly drift behind you. There is nowhere to rush, nothing left to finish, and no problem that needs solving tonight. For the next little while, there is only a quiet country road, the soft whisper of the wind, and a garden that has been waiting longer than anyone could imagine. The road was so narrow that most maps no longer bothered to show it. It curved gently through rolling hills where old maple trees stretched their branches over weathered fences, and fields of wildflowers nodded with every passing breeze. The nearest town was nearly 15 miles away, just large enough for a bakery, a post office, a hardware store, and a diner where everyone seemed to know everyone else's favorite breakfast. Few travelers ever came this way. Those who did usually noticed only the old stone wall. It stood beside the road, partly hidden beneath thick blankets of moss and climbing ivy. Time had softened every corner of the gray stones until they looked almost as though they had grown naturally from the earth instead of being carefully stacked by human hands. Most people assumed it marked the boundary of an abandoned farm. They drove past without slowing. Only someone curious enough to stop would notice something unusual. Behind the wall stood a weathered iron gate. Its hinges had long ago surrendered to rust, yet the gate remained slightly open, swaying almost silently whenever the breeze wandered through. Beyond it stretched a narrow footpath disappearing beneath towering oak trees whose leaves shimmered with countless shades of green. At the end of that path waited a forgotten garden. Not forgotten by nature. Nature remembered every inch of it. Only people had forgotten. One cool September morning, a man named Samuel Harper arrived carrying nothing more than a worn leather satchel, a notebook, and an old straw hat that had clearly seen many summers. Samuel wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't even particularly adventurous. He had spent nearly 40 years studying plants, quietly teaching botany at a small college where students appreciated his patience more than his lectures. His greatest excitement usually came from discovering a rare wildflower blooming beside an ordinary hiking trail. To Samuel, every leaf told a story. Every seed carried hope. Every tree deserved an introduction before being passed without notice. Now, at 68 years old, retirement had given him something he'd never possessed during his working years. Time. Time to wander. Time to wonder. Time to follow small mysteries simply because they existed. A week earlier, an elderly woman at the town library had mentioned an old garden no one visited anymore. "It has a plant," she had whispered with a smile. "A very unusual one." Samuel naturally asked what made it unusual. She simply shrugged. "No one's quite sure." That answer had been enough. Now he stood before the half-open iron gate. The morning air smelled wonderfully clean after overnight rain. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker tapped steadily against an old pine tree. Tiny drops of water still clung to spider webs stretched between tall grasses, catching sunlight like strings of tiny diamonds. Samuel stepped through the gate. The gravel path crunched softly beneath his boots. Almost immediately, the outside world seemed quieter. Not silent, just gentler. The breeze slowed. Birdsong became clearer. Even the sunlight appeared softer as it filtered through layers of ancient branches overhead. He smiled. "This place remembers how to be peaceful," he murmured. The garden slowly revealed itself. Stone pathways curved between flower beds that no longer followed any recognizable design. Lavender bushes grew beside climbing roses. Wild ferns stood shoulder to shoulder with carefully planted herbs. Apple trees leaned over forgotten benches. An old sundial rested slightly crooked among patches of thyme, whose pleasant scent rose with every step. Nothing looked neglected. Instead, everything seemed comfortably old, as though the garden had quietly decided that perfection was unnecessary. Nature and time had become partners here. Samuel walked slowly, stopping every few moments to admire tiny details. A mushroom growing from a fallen log. A butterfly resting with folded wings. The delicate pattern inside a maple leaf beginning to turn gold. Then he noticed something that made him pause. Near the center of the garden stood a circular flower bed surrounded by smooth river stones. Every plant inside that circle appeared familiar. Except one. It stood about waist high. Its slender stem supported broad emerald green leaves that shimmered ever so slightly despite the still air. The leaves weren't glossy. They weren't fuzzy. Yet somehow they reflected light differently than every surrounding plant. Almost as though sunlight preferred resting there. Samuel removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief, and looked again. Still unusual. He slowly circled the plant. No flowers. No fruit. No visible seeds. Its bark resembled polished cedar but carried faint silver lines that seemed almost painted. Most curious of all, there wasn't a single damaged leaf. No insect bites. No signs of disease. No weather scars. It looked impossibly healthy. Samuel opened his notebook. He carefully sketched the leaves, measured the stem, noted the surrounding soil, and quietly smiled to himself. "I've never met you before." The breeze stirred again. One leaf gently turned toward him. Not suddenly, not magically, simply enough to make him wonder whether the wind had truly been responsible. He chuckled softly. "I suppose gardens have their little mysteries." As the afternoon sun drifted westward, Samuel sat on a nearby wooden bench. The strange plant remained perfectly still. A pair of bluebirds landed nearby before flying away. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang 4 slow notes. Samuel had no idea that this peaceful afternoon would become the beginning of the greatest botanical mystery of his life. Nor could he possibly know that the quiet plant before him had already watched 2 centuries of seasons come and go. And if plants could remember, this one had stories enough to fill a lifetime. End of Chapter 1. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 2. The leaves that remembered rain. The following morning arrived without hurry. Long before the sun climbed above the eastern hills, the garden rested beneath a soft blanket of silver mist. Every blade of grass carried tiny beads of dew, and the air smelled wonderfully fresh, as though the earth itself had enjoyed a long, peaceful night's sleep. Samuel Harper woke in the small guest room above the town's old bakery. The room was simple. A wooden bed, a quilt stitched with blue wildflowers, a rocking chair beside a window overlooking the quiet street. When he opened the window, cool morning air drifted inside, carrying the comforting sense of fresh bread, damp soil, and distant pine trees. Somewhere below, the baker was already preparing cinnamon rolls. Samuel smiled. He had traveled across many states during his retirement, yet small towns always greeted the morning in nearly the same gentle way. No traffic rushing. No impatient horns. Only birds, fresh coffee, and people who still waved from front porches. After breakfast, he tucked his notebook into his satchel and returned to the forgotten garden. The old iron gate greeted him with the same faint creak. The gravel path welcomed his footsteps. Even the robins seemed to recognize him now, hopping confidently across the lawn without flying away. "It's good to see you again," Samuel whispered. He wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the birds or to the garden itself. When he reached the circular stone bed, the mysterious plant looked exactly as it had the day before. Perfect. Patient. Its emerald leaves seemed almost brighter beneath the cool morning light. Samuel knelt beside it, studying every detail with quiet fascination. He gently examined one leaf through a small magnifying lens. The tiny veins branching across its surface looked unlike anything recorded in his field guides. Instead of forming random patterns, they curved with graceful symmetry, almost resembling gentle rivers winding across an old map. He sketched another page in his notebook. After nearly an hour of observation, he leaned back on the nearby bench. I suppose every mystery deserves time. The garden seemed to agree. Hours slipped by almost unnoticed. Butterflies floated lazily among lavender blossoms. Honeybees visited tiny white flowers. A squirrel buried an acorn beneath a patch of thyme before immediately forgetting where it had hidden it. Samuel laughed quietly. That happens to all of us. By early afternoon, clouds slowly gathered overhead. Not dark storm clouds. Gentle gray ones that promised only peaceful rain. The breeze cooled. Leaves rustled softly. Somewhere beyond the hills came the distant rumble of thunder, so quiet it sounded almost sleepy. Then, the first raindrop fell. It landed upon one broad emerald leaf with the softest imaginable tap. Another followed. Then another. Soon the entire garden rested beneath a slow autumn shower. Samuel remained seated beneath the old oak tree beside the flower bed. Its wide branches sheltered him just enough to stay comfortably dry while still allowing him to enjoy the quiet music of falling rain. Rain had always been his favorite weather. Not heavy storms, just gentle showers that seemed to slow the entire world. He closed his notebook. There would be no more writing until the rain passed. Instead, he simply watched. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Water collected upon every leaf. Tiny streams wandered between stones. The scent of wet earth rose into the cool afternoon air. Then Samuel noticed something. The mysterious plant wasn't merely becoming wet. Its leaves appeared to shimmer. Very faintly. Almost invisibly. Each raindrop lingered a little longer than it should before slowly disappearing into the leaf without rolling away. The emerald color deepened. Silver veins beneath the surface became more noticeable. Samuel leaned forward. He blinked once, twice. He wasn't imagining it. The plant looked awake, not alive in the ordinary sense. Everything growing was alive. This felt different, almost as though the rain had reminded it of something. The surrounding garden remained perfectly ordinary. Only this single plant seemed quietly transformed. Samuel whispered to himself, "What are you remembering?" The rain continued. A soft breeze passed through the garden. One by one, the leaves turned, not toward the wind, but toward the falling rain itself. Slowly, gracefully, without haste, as though greeting an old friend. Samuel felt a peaceful shiver. Not fear, wonder. He had spent nearly half a century studying the natural world. He understood heliotropism, when flowers followed sunlight. He knew how vines searched for support and how roots sensed water beneath the soil. But this was something entirely different. The plant seemed to welcome the rain with recognition. Minutes passed. The gentle shower continued. Then something happened Samuel could never fully explain. As he gazed at the broad emerald leaves, he became aware of a feeling. Not a sound. Not a voice. Certainly not words. More like a memory. For just the briefest moment, he could almost picture another garden. Not this one. A different place. Young oak trees instead of towering giants. Fresh stone walls without moss. Children laughing somewhere beyond the hedges. A woman carrying a watering can made of polished copper. A little white cottage with smoke rising from its chimney. The image vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Samuel blinked. The old garden returned. The rain continued falling exactly as before. He rubbed his eyes. Well, he smiled to himself. Perhaps retirement has finally made me imaginative. Yet deep inside, he wasn't entirely convinced. The feeling had seemed too peaceful. Too detailed, too real, as though the plant had quietly shared the faintest echo of another afternoon. Long ago, the rain finally ended. Sunlight broke through scattered clouds, covering every leaf with tiny sparkling diamonds. The mysterious plant slowly returned to its ordinary appearance. The silver shimmer faded. The leaves rested peacefully once more. Nothing seemed unusual again, except Samuel. He opened his notebook. Instead of writing scientific observations, he found himself writing something entirely different. During rainfall, the plant appeared to awaken, not physically, but somehow emotionally. Impossible to explain. Felt less like observing nature, and more like listening to an old friend remembering childhood. He stared at the sentence for a long moment, then quietly laughed. No botanical journal would ever publish that. He closed the notebook. As evening approached, golden sunlight stretched long across the garden paths. Birds began settling into the trees. Crickets started their familiar evening chorus. Samuel rose from the bench. "I'll see you tomorrow." The breeze answered with the gentlest rustle. As he walked back toward the old iron gate, he never noticed one final detail. Behind him, one single emerald leaf remained turned toward the path where he had been sitting, almost as though, for the first time in many decades, the ancient plant had begun remembering someone new. And somewhere beneath the quiet soil, hidden among roots older than anyone could imagine, something long asleep had gently begun to stir. End of Chapter 2. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 3. A letter written 200 years ago. Morning arrived softly, almost as though it didn't wish to disturb the quiet valley. Thin ribbons of fog drifted lazily above the meadows before slowly melting into the warming sunlight. A pair of white-tailed deer crossed the distant hillside, pausing every few steps to nibble on fresh grass before disappearing into a grove of towering maples. Samuel Harper found himself smiling before he'd even finished his morning coffee. Some places had that effect. They gently reminded people that life had once moved at the pace of birds, rivers, and changing seasons rather than clocks and calendars. After breakfast, he walked the familiar road once again. The old stone wall appeared exactly where he'd left it. Moss covered the weathered rocks. Wild violets peeked through narrow cracks. The rusty gate swayed ever so slightly in the breeze, as if quietly welcoming another visitor. "Good morning," Samuel said with a cheerful nod. He wasn't entirely joking anymore. The garden somehow felt less like a place and more like an old friend. Inside, everything glowed beneath the fresh morning sun. Tiny droplets still clung to rose petals. A hummingbird hovered beside bright scarlet bee balm before vanishing in a flash of emerald feathers. The scent of lavender drifted through the cool air, mixing with mint, damp soil, and cedar. Samuel wandered slowly instead of walking directly toward the mysterious plant. There was something wonderfully comforting about taking his time. He stopped beside an old apple tree whose branches bent low with fruit. He admired a family of rabbits quietly nibbling clover beneath a hedge. He even paused to rescue a ladybug that had become trapped inside an overturned flower pot. "There you go," he whispered, watching it climb happily onto a nearby leaf. The little things mattered. Perhaps they always had. When he finally reached the circular flower bed, the ancient plant stood exactly where it always had. Still, graceful, patient. Its emerald leaves shimmered faintly beneath the sunlight, though today they looked almost content. Samuel chuckled. "I know plants don't smile." He tilted his head. "But if one ever could." The thought made him laugh quietly. He settled onto the weathered bench and spent another peaceful hour sketching the unusual patterns inside its leaves. As he worked, something else slowly caught his attention. Just beyond the flower bed, nearly hidden beneath climbing ivy and tangled blackberry vines, stood a small stone building. He had noticed it before, but assumed it was an old garden shed. Today, curiosity gently tugged at him. Curiosity had guided most of his happiest days. He carefully pushed aside the vines. An old wooden door appeared beneath them. Its faded green paint had nearly disappeared beneath 2 centuries of weather. A rusted brass handle still clung stubbornly to the door. Above it hung a cracked wooden sign. Only 3 letters remained readable. Ooze. Perhaps it had once said glasshouse or greenhouse. Samuel rested his hand upon the weathered wood. It opened surprisingly easily. The hinges groaned, not in complaint, but almost in relief. A cool breath of air drifted from inside. The room smelled of cedar shelves, dried herbs, old books, and the unmistakable scent of aged paper. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight streaming from broken glass panels high above. Rows of empty clay pots lined wooden shelves. Bundles of dried lavender still hung from ceiling beams. Glass bottles filled with long-evaporated tinctures stood quietly where someone had carefully arranged them many decades before. Nothing appeared abandoned. Only paused, as though the owner had simply stepped outside for a walk and never returned. Samuel moved carefully. He never enjoyed disturbing places that carried history. Near one corner stood an enormous oak work table covered by a faded linen cloth. He gently lifted one edge. Beneath it rested several leather-bound journals, a brass magnifying glass, a pair of old gardening shears, and a small cedar box tied neatly with blue ribbon. Samuel's heartbeat quickened, though not from excitement, from reverence. He untied the ribbon. Inside lay dozens of carefully folded letters. Most had yellowed with age. Some remained sealed. Others had already been opened long ago. Resting neatly on top was one envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. To whoever finds this garden. Samuel blinked. He carefully unfolded the letter. The paper felt surprisingly sturdy despite its age. The ink had faded slightly, yet every word remained beautifully readable. He began reading. If you are holding this letter, then many years have surely passed since these words were written. Perhaps I am only a name now. Perhaps no one remembers this little garden. That is perfectly all right. Gardens have never asked to be remembered. They simply continue growing. Samuel smiled warmly. Whoever had written this understood plants deeply. He continued, "Should the garden still remain, I hope you have found the emerald plant near the center stones. Many have mistaken it for something extraordinary. It is not. It asks for no praise. It performs no miracles. It simply lives, patiently, longer than nearly anything I have ever known." Samuel slowly lowered the page. His eyes drifted instinctively toward the window. Outside, the mysterious plant stood peacefully in the sunlight, exactly where the letter described. He looked back down. "I planted it as a very young man. An old traveler from across the Atlantic entrusted me with a single seed. He claimed his grandfather had carried it from an ancient monastery hidden among distant mountains. Whether that tale was true, I never discovered. But the seed grew." Samuel felt goosebumps rise along his arms. He turned another page. Years passed, then decades. Neighbors grew old. Children became grandparents. Houses changed owners. Roads changed direction. Wars came and ended. Winters buried the garden beneath deep snow. Springs awakened it once more. Yet the emerald plant remained exactly as it had always been. Watching, growing, remembering. The word lingered in Samuel's thoughts. He remembered the rain, the strange feeling, the peaceful glimpse of another time. His fingers tightened gently around the letter. Could the writer have experienced the same thing? Near the bottom of the final page appeared one last paragraph. The handwriting had grown slower, perhaps older. If you should ever notice the leaves changing during rain, do not be frightened. Simply sit quietly. Listen. Nature remembers in ways people sometimes forget. The oldest living things are not eager to speak. But if you are patient, they occasionally choose to share. The letter ended with a signature. Elias Whitmore, April 14th, 1827. Samuel stared silently at the date. Almost exactly 200 years ago. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the garden. The emerald leaves rustled softly. Not loudly, not urgently. Simply enough to remind him that they were still there, waiting. Samuel carefully folded the letter exactly as he had found it. He placed it back inside the cedar box. Some discoveries didn't belong in museums. Some belonged exactly where time had protected them. As he stepped back into the afternoon sunshine, he looked once more toward the ancient plant. It stood peacefully beneath drifting clouds. Calm, patient, almost as though it had been expecting someone to read that letter. And somewhere beneath the rich, dark earth, hidden below 2 centuries of roots, a single tiny seed, unnoticed until this very moment, had begun to crack open. Not from age, not from rain, but from something else entirely. Something that had been waiting exactly 200 years. End of Chapter 3. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 4. Every visitor left a story. That evening, Samuel found it surprisingly difficult to fall asleep. Not because his mind was racing. Quite the opposite. It had become wonderfully still. The kind of stillness that arrives after spending an entire day outdoors, where every breath seems deeper than usual and every thought slows to the gentle rhythm of rustling leaves. The old letter rested in his memory. Nature remembers in ways people sometimes forget. Those words drifted through his thoughts like autumn leaves floating across a quiet pond. He wondered about Elias Whitmore. What kind of man had patiently cared for the garden 2 centuries earlier? Had he sat on the same weathered bench, watched the same robins build their nests, listened to rain tapping softly against greenhouse windows? Most of all, had he ever discovered why the emerald plant lived so long? Samuel smiled into the darkness. Perhaps not every mystery wanted solving. Some simply wanted company. Morning sunshine arrived golden and warm. Instead of heading straight to the garden after breakfast, Samuel wandered through the little town first. Main Street had only a handful of buildings, but each seemed to carry a story. The bakery smelled of fresh blueberry muffins. A barber swept yesterday's hair from the sidewalk. An elderly couple slowly arranged pumpkins outside a small grocery store. Nothing seemed hurried. Even conversations moved gently. Outside the hardware store, an old man sat in a rocking chair feeding peanuts to a family of blue jays. He looked up as Samuel passed. "You're the fellow visiting Whitmore Garden." Samuel stopped. "You know the garden?" The old man chuckled. "Oh, everyone around here knows it. But hardly anybody visits anymore." Samuel leaned against the white fence. "Were you ever there?" "When I was a boy." The old man smiled toward the distant hills. "My grandmother took me every spring." "What do you remember?" He thought for a moment. "The quiet." Samuel nodded. "It is unusually peaceful." "No," the man said softly. "It isn't just peaceful. It makes people remember being peaceful." The words lingered between them. After a few moments, the old man added something unexpected. "My grandmother always picked one little wildflower before we left." "Did the garden mind?" He laughed. "She said gardens like sharing." Then he tipped his hat. You enjoy your visit." Samuel thanked him and continued walking. By the time he reached the old stone wall, he couldn't stop thinking about that simple sentence. It makes people remember being peaceful. Perhaps that explained why he never wanted to leave. Inside the garden, the morning unfolded with its familiar gentleness. The breeze wandered lazily through oak branches. Bees hummed contentedly among lavender blossoms. Somewhere overhead, morning doves called softly to one another. The mysterious plant waited in the center as though nothing in the world could ever disturb its patience. Samuel settled onto the bench with Elias Whitmore's journal. Today he intended to read more carefully. The leather binding creaked gently as he opened another section. Most pages contained sketches, beautiful drawings of flowers, vines, mushrooms, and herbs, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Occasionally, Elias had written short observations. The first snowfall arrived early this year. Bluebirds nested beside the greenhouse. Mrs. Carter's roses finally bloomed. The journal wasn't written like scientific research. It felt more like a conversation with the seasons. Then Samuel found a page unlike the others. Across the top, Elias had written, "Visitors." Beneath it appeared dozens of names, some accompanied by only a sentence. Others filled nearly an entire page. Samuel began reading. Sarah, age 7, collected smooth stones and believed butterflies carried messages between flowers. Left smiling. Mr. Henderson lost his wife during the winter. Sat beside the emerald plant for nearly 2 hours without speaking. Returned home lighter than he arrived. A traveling violin player performed 3 quiet songs beneath the oak tree. The garden seemed grateful. Samuel paused. The entries continued for decades. Children, travelers, farmers, teachers, soldiers returning from war, newly married couples, widows, grandparents, people celebrating, people grieving, people simply wandering. Each had visited. Each had left changed somehow. Never dramatically. Never magically. Just a little calmer. A little lighter. As though they had remembered something important. Something life had almost convinced them to forget. Samuel slowly closed the journal. Outside, sunlight filtered gently through the leaves overhead. He realized something remarkable. Elias had rarely written about the plant itself. Instead, he wrote about the people who came to see it, almost as though the plant wasn't the true subject. People were. A cheerful voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me." Samuel looked up. Standing near the garden gate was a little girl holding her grandfather's hand. She couldn't have been older than 8. She wore bright yellow rain boots despite the perfectly dry weather. Her grandfather smiled warmly. "We hope we're not bothering you." "Not at all," Samuel replied. "We were just taking a walk," the older man explained. "My granddaughter has never seen the garden." The little girl looked around with wide eyes. "It's beautiful." Samuel smiled. "It certainly is." She wandered slowly among the flowers, stopping to admire bees, smelling lavender, watching dragonflies skim across a tiny pond. Finally, she reached the mysterious emerald plant. She tilted her head. "It looks lonely." Samuel blinked. "I hadn't thought of that." The little girl gently placed her small hand on one of the smooth river stones surrounding it. "You've been here a long time." Her voice was barely above a whisper. For several quiet moments, nothing happened. The breeze drifted softly through the garden. A butterfly landed nearby. Then the little girl smiled. "It says it's okay." Samuel exchanged a curious glance with her grandfather. "What says it's okay?" "The plant." Her answer sounded perfectly ordinary. Not imaginative, not theatrical, simply matter of fact. It's waited a long time, but it doesn't mind. Her grandfather chuckled softly. Children have wonderful imaginations. Samuel wasn't so sure. Before leaving, the little girl reached into her pocket. She removed a tiny polished acorn. "I found this yesterday." She carefully placed it beside one of the stones. "A present." Then she waved goodbye. As they disappeared down the path, Samuel looked toward the emerald plant. A gentle breeze passed. One broad leaf dipped almost imperceptibly, like the smallest nod imaginable. Late that afternoon, Samuel opened Elias Whitmore's journal once again. On a blank page near the back, he hesitated. Then he picked up his fountain pen. Carefully, he wrote, "Emily, age 8. Brought an acorn for the garden because she thought the plant looked lonely. Left smiling." He stared at the fresh ink. For a moment, it almost felt as though Elias himself would approve. The journal wasn't finished after all. Its story had simply been waiting for someone new to continue writing it. As the sun slowly slipped below the hills, long golden shadows stretched across the garden. The emerald plant glowed softly in the evening light. Samuel closed the journal and rested it gently on his lap. He suddenly understood something he hadn't realized before. Perhaps the ancient plant wasn't collecting years. Perhaps it was collecting people. Their laughter, their kindness, their quiet afternoons, their peaceful moments, like invisible leaves added to a tree no one else could see. And as twilight settled over the forgotten garden, another page of its 200-year story had quietly been written. Somewhere deep beneath the roots, the tiny seed that had cracked open the day before had grown just enough to send a single delicate root into the cool, dark earth. Its journey, at long last, had begun. End of Chapter 4. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 5. The seasons that never truly passed. The garden always seemed to wake before the rest of the world. Long before the first porch light flickered off in town, before the bakery warmed its ovens, and before the morning birds began their cheerful conversations, the old garden was already quietly alive. The wind wandered gently through the tall oaks. The fountain, though cracked with age, still whispered as fresh spring water trickled over smooth stones. Tiny insects stirred beneath broad fern leaves. Even the ancient emerald plant seemed to greet the sunrise without moving at all. Samuel arrived just as the eastern sky turned from deep blue to pale gold. He carried no notebook today, no magnifying glass, no measuring tape, only a small woven basket with a thermos of coffee, 2 blueberry muffins, and a wool blanket folded neatly beneath his arm. He had begun to realize something. Not every visit required studying. Some days were meant simply for being present. He spread the blanket beneath the old oak tree where the morning sun peeked through dancing branches. Steam curled gently from his coffee as he watched tiny clouds drift lazily overhead. For the first time in many years, he had nowhere else he wished to be. He smiled quietly. "Good morning." The greeting was meant for the garden. The breeze answered with its familiar rustle. Hours passed almost unnoticed. Time behaved differently here. Back home, a morning often disappeared beneath errands, appointments, and clocks. Here, time stretched comfortably. One butterfly could hold his attention for several peaceful minutes. Watching sunlight move across the stone pathway somehow became interesting. Even listening to bees moving from blossom to blossom felt strangely comforting. Samuel wondered whether this was how childhood had once felt, before everyone learned to hurry. Near noon, he opened Elias Whitmore's journal again. Today's pages were different. Instead of recording visitors, Elias had written about the changing seasons. Each year appeared almost identical. Yet each spring seemed new to him. Samuel began reading. Spring arrived gently today. The robins returned before sunrise. Mrs. Whitaker says winter felt longer than usual. The emerald plant remains unchanged. Several pages later, the first fireflies appeared tonight. Young Thomas insisted they were tiny lanterns carried by invisible gardeners. I did not correct him. Samuel chuckled softly. Some explanations were more beautiful than facts. He turned another page. Autumn covered the maples in copper and crimson. Children gathered leaves taller than themselves. The emerald plant remained green. Another year. Another entry. The snow reached nearly 3 feet this winter. The greenhouse roof groaned beneath its weight. The emerald plant rested beneath white silence. Spring found it waiting. Samuel paused. Nearly every season had been carefully described. Year after year. Decade after decade. Yet one sentence quietly repeated itself. The emerald plant remained. Not bloomed. Not changed. Not struggled. Simply remained. There was something deeply comforting about that. In a world where nearly everything changed, something had quietly stayed faithful to its place. A soft breeze lifted the journal pages. One loose sheet slipped gently onto the grass. Samuel picked it up. Unlike the others, it wasn't dated. Instead, Elias had written a thoughtful reflection. People often ask how old the plant truly is. I no longer believe age is the proper question. The better question is, how many mornings has it watched? Samuel looked around the peaceful garden. Morning after morning, year after year. Imagine watching the first horse-drawn wagons roll past the valley. Watching children who played beneath these trees grow old enough to bring grandchildren. Watching storms pass. Watching wars begin far away and peace quietly return. Watching countless springs arrive without ever growing impatient. He leaned back against the oak tree. 200 years. The number suddenly felt much larger than before. His thoughts drifted naturally. The plant had lived while presidents changed, while railroads crossed continents, while electricity reached little towns, while airplanes first flew, while people eventually carried tiny computers in their pockets. Yet here, none of that seemed important. The oak trees still dropped acorns. The robins still returned. Rain still smelled exactly as it always had. Perhaps nature measured history differently. Not by inventions, not by headlines, but by seasons. That afternoon, Samuel noticed something he had somehow overlooked. Near the circular flower bed stood several enormous stones arranged in a rough half-circle. Each carried tiny scratches. At first glance they appeared random, but curiosity encouraged him to look closer. He brushed away moss with remarkable care. Tiny initials, dates, names, not carved deeply, only lightly, as though visitors wished to leave memories without harming the stones. He found one from 1849, another from 1906, another from 1958. Some simply read, "Thank you." One said, "Needed this today." Another, "See you next spring." Samuel smiled. The garden had become a quiet guestbook long before anyone imagined social media or visitor centers. People had always wanted to remember places that made them feel peaceful. Clouds slowly drifted overhead during the afternoon. Their shadows wandered lazily across the flower beds. The emerald plant stood unchanged. Samuel suddenly wondered how many conversations it had overheard. Marriage proposals. Children asking impossible questions. Grandparents telling family stories. People reading books beneath the trees. People crying quietly after difficult days. People laughing until birds flew from nearby branches. Life. Ordinary life. Perhaps that was the greatest treasure of all. As evening approached, the garden grew even quieter. The sunlight softened into warm amber. Crickets prepared their nightly concert. The air carried hints of pine, lavender, and cooling earth. Samuel poured the last cup of coffee from his thermos. It had gone lukewarm. He didn't mind. Warm enough was sometimes perfect. He looked toward the emerald plant. "You've seen so much," the breeze answered. Gentle, patient, almost reassuring. Then something curious happened. A single leaf loosened from the highest branch. Samuel expected it to drift downward like every autumn leaf he'd ever seen. Instead, it floated. Not upward, not magically, simply, very slowly. The evening breeze carried it in lazy circles across the flower bed before placing it gently beside Samuel's blanket. He picked it up. Unlike ordinary leaves, it wasn't dry. It remained wonderfully soft, flexible, cool to the touch. Tiny silver veins shimmered faintly beneath its emerald surface. Without quite knowing why, Samuel slipped it carefully between the pages of his notebook. Not as a scientific sample, more like a keepsake, a reminder that some moments deserved preserving. Just as people once pressed wildflowers inside favorite books. The sun finally slipped below the western hills. Golden light faded into lavender skies. The first stars quietly appeared overhead. Samuel folded his blanket, collected his basket, and before leaving, he looked back one last time. The ancient plant stood peacefully beneath the growing twilight, silent as always. Yet somehow, it no longer seemed lonely, because every season it had witnessed, every visitor it had welcomed, every quiet afternoon it had shared, still lived gently within it. And somewhere beneath the cool evening soil, the tiny seed continued its silent journey. Its first fragile root had already found water. Its first tiny shoot was beginning to reach upward, toward a world it had never seen, toward the same sky its ancient parent had watched for 200 years. End of Chapter 5. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 6. The bird that returned every spring. By the end of the week, Samuel no longer needed a map to find the forgotten garden. His feet seemed to remember the way before his mind did. He knew exactly where the old stone wall curved beside the road, where the wild blackberry bushes grew thickest, and where the iron gate gave its familiar little creak, almost like an old friend clearing its throat before saying hello. Each morning followed the same gentle rhythm. A warm cup of coffee from the bakery. A cheerful wave from Mrs. Collins as she swept her front porch. The smell of fresh pine carried on the breeze. Then the quiet walk beneath the towering oaks. There was comfort in the routine. Perhaps that was one of the reasons people loved gardens. Plants never hurried. They never worried about tomorrow. They simply greeted each sunrise as though it were exactly enough. The morning air carried the first hint of autumn. Not cold, just crisp enough to make Samuel zip his light jacket before stepping through the gate. The garden looked different today. Not dramatically, only in the tiny ways that nature changes almost unnoticed. Several maple leaves had begun turning shades of amber. Spiderwebs stretched between tall grasses, sparkling with dew. Goldenrod swayed gently beside clusters of late-blooming asters. Everything whispered that another season was slowly approaching. The emerald plant, however, remained exactly as it always had. Its broad leaves were still deep green, untouched by autumn's paintbrush. Samuel smiled. "You really do have your own schedule." He settled onto the old bench and watched the morning unfold. Sometimes doing nothing became the most interesting thing of all. A flutter of wings caught his attention. A small robin landed on one of the smooth river stones surrounding the mysterious plant. Its chest glowed a warm reddish-orange in the morning light. The little bird cocked its head first one way, then the other, studying the emerald leaves with remarkable concentration. Samuel remained perfectly still. The robin hopped closer. Not nervous, not hurried, almost familiar. After a few quiet moments, it flew onto one of the lower branches of the ancient plant itself. There it remained, perfectly content. The bird sang only one short melody, 4 clear notes. Simple, gentle, almost like a greeting. Then it flew away toward the old oak trees. Samuel watched until it disappeared. "Well," he said quietly, "you certainly seemed comfortable." Later that afternoon, Samuel opened Elias Whitmore's journal once again. He had begun reading it the way some people read favorite novels. Not searching for answers, simply enjoying the company of the writer. As he turned another page, one heading immediately caught his attention. The robin. His eyebrows lifted. He began reading. "The little robin returned today. It always arrives within a few days of the first warm spring rain. I believe it nests in the old oak overlooking the garden. Perhaps it is the same bird." Samuel smiled. That seemed unlikely. Even the longest-lived robins survived only a handful of years. He continued reading. Several pages later, another entry appeared. "The robin has returned again. It landed upon the emerald plant before visiting any other tree. Curious habit. More pages. More years. Always the same note. The robin returned. The robin greeted the garden. The robin sang beside the emerald leaves." Samuel slowly closed the journal. A peaceful realization settled over him. Of course, it wasn't the same robin. It couldn't be. But perhaps it was the same family, generation after generation. Each spring, young robins returned to the place their parents had known. Without maps, without signs, without anyone telling them where to go. Nature carried remarkable memories, not only in plants, but in birds, in rivers, even in the changing stars overhead. The following morning, Samuel arrived earlier than usual. Mist still lingered across the flower beds. The entire garden felt wrapped in soft silver light. He had barely reached the bench when he heard it. 4 gentle notes. Exactly the same melody. The robin. It landed once again upon the emerald plant. This time, Samuel noticed something else. The bird wasn't alone. Behind it came another robin. Slightly smaller. Its feathers looked younger, less vivid, perhaps one of the season's fledglings. The older bird hopped across the broad emerald leaves. The younger one carefully followed. Neither seemed afraid. They explored the plant for several quiet minutes before flying together toward the old oak. Samuel watched them disappear into the branches. A smile spread across his face. They're teaching each other. The thought filled him with unexpected warmth. Some lessons couldn't be spoken. They simply had to be shown. That afternoon brought a gentle breeze. Clouds drifted slowly overhead. Samuel wandered farther into the garden than before. Behind the greenhouse, he discovered an old wooden birdhouse attached to a cedar post. Its paint had long since faded. Moss covered part of its roof. Yet someone had lovingly repaired it many times over the years. Tiny nails, carefully replaced boards, fresh twine securing one corner. Inside rested a neatly woven robin's nest. Empty now, but unmistakably well cared for. Tucked beneath the birdhouse roof was a tiny brass plaque. The words had faded almost beyond recognition. Samuel gently brushed away the dust. It read, For every spring that returns. Nothing more. No date. No name. Just those 4 words. Samuel stood quietly for several moments. Some memorials celebrated people. Others celebrated hope. As evening approached, he returned to the circular flower bed. The emerald plant shimmered softly beneath the lowering sun. The robin appeared once more. This time, it carried something in its beak. Not food. Not nesting material. A tiny white feather. The bird gently placed it among the smooth river stones before flying away. Samuel blinked. Well, he laughed softly. I suppose everyone brings gifts. The little girl's acorn still rested nearby. Now a feather. The garden accepted both with equal grace. Just before sunset, Samuel noticed something he had never seen before. The breeze strengthened ever so slightly. Not enough to sway the heavy oak branches. Just enough to stir the broad emerald leaves. As they moved together, they produced the faintest whispering sound. Not ordinary rustling. The leaves seemed to brush against one another in perfect rhythm, like pages turning inside an old book. Samuel closed his eyes. The sound washed gently over him. For one peaceful moment, he imagined every spring the plant had ever witnessed. Children running barefoot through wildflowers. Farmers returning home at dusk. Couples walking hand in hand beneath blooming apple trees. Birds building nests. Grandparents telling stories on warm afternoons. The garden had seen them all, not as separate memories, but as one long, beautiful song. When Samuel opened his eyes again, the whispering had stopped. The leaves rested quietly beneath the evening sky. The robin sang its familiar 4-note melody one final time before disappearing into the trees. Samuel gathered his things. As he walked toward the old gate, he turned back one last time. The emerald plant stood peacefully beneath the first stars of the evening. Patient, steady, faithful, waiting for another spring, another robin, another visitor, another story. Deep beneath the soil, the tiny seed continued its quiet journey toward the light. And although no one could yet see it, its first 2 delicate leaves had begun unfolding in the darkness. The future, like the changing seasons, had already begun. End of Chapter 6. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 7. Moonlight on the old greenhouse glass. There is a special kind of quiet that belongs only to evening. Not the silence of an empty room. Not the stillness after a storm. But the gentle hush that settles over the world when the day's work is finished. Porch lights begin to glow, and even the birds seem content to whisper instead of sing. Samuel had always loved that hour. The hour when daylight slowly loosened its grip and the stars patiently took their places overhead. Until now, however, he had never remained in the forgotten garden after sunset. The townspeople always assumed the garden slept at night. Samuel wondered if that was really true. That afternoon passed peacefully. He read beneath the old oak, watched butterflies drift lazily among the lavender, shared half of a blueberry muffin with an especially brave squirrel who accepted tiny crumbs before politely retreating beneath a cedar bush. Nothing unusual happened, and somehow that made the day perfect. As the sun began sinking toward the western hills, warm golden light poured across the garden. Every flower seemed to glow from within. The emerald plant caught the fading sunlight like polished jade, its broad leaves reflecting soft shades of green and silver. Samuel looked toward the old town. He could just make out the church steeple above the treetops. Soon the evening bell would ring. Normally, he would gather his notebook and begin the walk back. Tonight, he stayed. The church bell echoed gently across the valley. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 slow notes floated through the cool evening air before disappearing into the distant hills. A breeze wandered softly through the garden. Daytime birds gradually grew quiet. Their songs gave way to the gentle chirping of crickets hidden beneath tall grasses. Fireflies appeared one by one, not all at once. Just a tiny light here, another there, until the entire garden seemed sprinkled with floating stars. Samuel smiled. No photograph could ever do this justice. He spread his blanket beside the circular flower bed. The old greenhouse stood only a short distance away, its cracked glass catching the final hints of sunset. Some panes reflected orange skies. Others reflected deepening shades of blue. For a long while, Samuel simply watched the colors change. Nature never hurried through sunset. Why should anyone else? Darkness arrived slowly. The first true stars appeared above the tallest oak. Then another. Then dozens. The moon rose quietly from behind the eastern ridge. It wasn't full, only a few nights away. Its pale silver light washed gently across the forgotten garden. Flowers that had looked bright and colorful during the day now appeared soft and dreamlike. The stone pathways glowed faintly. The fountain shimmered. Even the old iron gate looked almost graceful beneath the moonlight. Samuel noticed something unexpected. The greenhouse windows had become mirrors. Instead of showing their dusty interior, they reflected the moon, the trees, and the quiet garden around them. Every cracked pane held a slightly different piece of the night sky. It was as though hundreds of tiny moons floated among the vines. A familiar sound interrupted his thoughts. 4 gentle notes. The robin. Samuel looked upward. Sure enough, the little bird perched quietly upon the highest branch of the old oak. Birds rarely sang after dark. Yet this melody felt less like singing, more like saying good night. The robin tucked its head beneath one wing. Within moments, it had fallen asleep. Samuel smiled. So have a peaceful night. The moon climbed higher. Its light eventually reached the emerald plant. Something remarkable happened. The silver veins inside its leaves became visible once again. Not brightly, only faintly, like tiny rivers glowing beneath green glass. Samuel leaned forward. The leaves themselves hadn't changed. Only the moonlight revealed what daylight usually concealed. The effect was breathtaking. Every leaf shimmered softly, almost breathing with the rhythm of the gentle breeze. He remembered Elias Whitmore's words. The oldest living things are not eager to speak. Perhaps they didn't need words. Perhaps beauty had always been enough. Curiosity gently drew Samuel toward the greenhouse. He pushed open the weathered wooden door. The familiar scent greeted him immediately. Old cedar, dried lavender, a trace of rosemary, and the unmistakable fragrance of books that had rested peacefully for generations. Moonlight entered through broken glass panels high above. Long silver beams stretched across the wooden floor. Dust drifted lazily through the light like tiny snowflakes. Everything looked different at night. Not frightening, simply quieter, more thoughtful. Samuel slowly wandered among the empty shelves. His footsteps echoed softly against old stone walls. Near the back of the greenhouse stood a narrow wooden cabinet he hadn't noticed before. Its door had swollen with age, requiring gentle pressure before it finally opened. Inside rested only 3 things: a folded wool scarf, an old brass lantern, and a small wooden music box. Samuel carefully lifted the music box into his hands. It wasn't expensive. Plain walnut, smooth from years of careful handling. Tiny flowers had been carved around its edges. No name, no inscription, only craftsmanship born from patience. He hesitated, then slowly turned the little brass key. The music began so softly he almost thought he imagined it. A gentle lullaby floated into the quiet greenhouse. Simple, slow, Comforting. The melody felt strangely familiar, though Samuel couldn't remember where he'd heard anything like it before. Perhaps nowhere. Perhaps it simply sounded like childhood, like safe evenings, like home. He carried the music box outside. The lullaby drifted gently across the moonlit garden. Nothing dramatic happened. No mysterious lights. No sudden movements. Only the breeze slowing slightly, as though even the wind wished to listen. The emerald plant shimmered peacefully beneath the moon. Its leaves moved almost imperceptibly in rhythm with the music. Samuel wasn't certain whether it was imagination. He didn't particularly care. Some moments became smaller when explained. Others became larger when simply experienced. Tonight belonged to the second kind. The melody gradually came to an end. The final note lingered in the cool night air before fading into silence. Samuel closed the music box carefully. For several minutes he simply sat beneath the old oak. Above him, thousands of stars stretched from one horizon to the other. He realized something. The plant had lived through 200 years of nights exactly like this. 200 years of moonrises, of constellations slowly shifting across the seasons, of owls calling from distant woods, of sleeping robins nestled safely among branches. How many people had sat beneath this same sky? How many had looked upward and quietly forgotten their worries? Perhaps more than anyone would ever know. As midnight approached, a thin veil of clouds drifted across the moon. The garden grew softer still. Samuel stood and gently returned the music box to its cabinet inside the greenhouse. Some treasures were meant to stay exactly where they belonged. Before leaving, he looked once more toward the emerald plant. Moonlight rested upon its highest leaves. Then, for just the briefest moment, one tiny point of silver light appeared near its base. Not on a leaf, not in the air, down among the roots. Samuel blinked. The light disappeared. He smiled to himself. Good night. Whether he had seen moonlight reflecting from dew, or something entirely different, he couldn't say. And somehow, it didn't matter. The garden had never demanded certainty. Only patience. Only wonder. As Samuel quietly walked back toward the old iron gate, he never noticed the tiny sprout beneath the ancient plant. It had finally reached the surface. Two delicate emerald leaves unfolded beneath the moon for the very first time. The young plant greeted the night in complete silence. Above it, the ancient parent stood watch, just as it had for 200 peaceful years. And together, beneath the quiet stars, old life and new life shared the same gentle moonlight. End of Chapter 7. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 8. Children who grew into grandparents. The little sprout was easy to miss. It stood no taller than Samuel's thumb, tucked quietly beside the broad roots of the ancient emerald plant. Its two tiny leaves caught the early morning light with the same gentle silver shimmer as its towering parent. If someone had hurried past, they would have walked within inches of it without ever noticing. But gardens rarely revealed their smallest wonders to people in a hurry. Samuel arrived just after sunrise, carrying a woven basket with fresh strawberries, a loaf of warm bread from the bakery, and a small thermos of chamomile tea. The baker had smiled as she handed him the bread. "Looks like the garden has become your favorite customer." Samuel had laughed. "I believe I'm the one being looked after." She hadn't asked what he meant. In small towns, people understood that not every answer needed explaining. As he stepped through the familiar iron gate, everything greeted him as though he had never left. The lavender carried its sweet fragrance into the cool air. A pair of bluebirds darted between the apple trees. The fountain whispered softly over smooth stones. Even the breeze seemed to recognize the gentle rhythm of his footsteps. Then, as he approached the circular flower bed, something caught his eye. He stopped. There, nestled beside the ancient roots, stood the tiny sprout. Samuel knelt immediately. His smile appeared before he even realized it. "Well, so you've decided to introduce yourself." The tiny leaves looked almost translucent in the morning light. They carried the same delicate silver veins, the same rich emerald color, only smaller, much, much smaller. Samuel carefully examined the soil around it. No sign that anyone had planted it. No disturbed earth. No footprints. It had simply appeared. Or perhaps it had always been growing quietly beneath the surface, waiting for exactly the right season. He reached for his notebook. For several minutes he sketched the young plant with remarkable care. Every curve, every vein, every tiny leaf. When he finished, he closed the notebook without writing a single scientific conclusion. Some discoveries deserved admiration before explanation. Later that morning, while Samuel sat beneath the oak tree enjoying his tea, he heard voices drifting through the garden gate. Not loud voices, happy ones. A grandmother entered slowly, holding the hands of two children. A boy, perhaps 10 years old. A little girl who couldn't have been older than 6. The children looked around with wide eyes. "It's like a fairy garden," the little girl whispered. Her grandmother smiled. "I thought the very same thing when I was your age." Samuel looked up. "You've been here before?" "Oh yes." The woman laughed softly. "Many times." She paused near the old bench. "My grandfather brought me here after school." Samuel felt a pleasant surprise. "When was that?" She thought for a moment. "Oh, about 60 years ago." The words floated gently through the quiet garden. 60 years. The ancient plant hadn't merely watched strangers. It had quietly welcomed generations. The little boy wandered toward the emerald plant. "It looks older than everything else." His grandmother nodded. "It probably is." The little girl carefully placed a tiny pine cone beside the acorn Emily had left days earlier. "There. So it has another friend." Samuel smiled. The circle of gifts was slowly growing. An acorn, a feather, now a pine cone. Simple offerings, given without expectation. The grandmother slowly settled onto the old wooden bench. She ran her fingers gently across its weathered surface. "I remember sitting right here." Samuel sat beside her. "What do you remember most?" She looked toward the emerald plant. "The feeling." He smiled. "Everyone seems to say that." She nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather worked long days at the sawmill. He didn't talk very much. But every spring, he brought me here. We'd sit for hours. Sometimes we'd eat sandwiches. Sometimes we'd watch butterflies. Sometimes we'd say nothing at all." Samuel listened quietly. "He used to tell me something." "What was that?" She smiled. "If you ever feel the world moving too fast." She paused, looking around the peaceful garden. "Find something that's been standing still for a very long time." Neither of them spoke for several moments afterward. The breeze gently stirred the emerald leaves. The children soon discovered the old greenhouse. Their laughter echoed softly as they peeked through dusty windows. "Grandma, come look." She stood carefully and joined them. Inside, the little boy found one of Elias Whitmore's botanical sketches displayed beneath the glass of the old work table. "It's beautiful." "It is," his grandmother agreed. "People used to draw everything by hand." The little girl pointed toward a faded watercolor painting hanging on the wall. It showed the garden many decades earlier. Young oak trees, fresh flower beds, a bright white cottage in the distance, and there, standing proudly in the center, the same emerald plant. only smaller. Samuel stepped closer. His heart skipped pleasantly. The painting had been signed. Margaret Whitmore. Spring, 1869. Nearly 160 years ago. The garden had looked younger. The trees had grown taller since then. The greenhouse roof had weathered. The pathways had softened. But the plant had hardly changed at all. Back outside, the children began collecting fallen leaves. Not to keep, to compare. This one looks like a heart. This one's shaped like a star. The grandmother laughed. Nature has always been the best artist. Samuel found himself thinking about childhood. How easily children noticed beauty adults often hurried past. A colorful beetle. An unusually shaped cloud. A feather. A smooth stone. Perhaps growing older didn't mean losing wonder. Perhaps it simply meant remembering how to look again. As afternoon drifted lazily toward evening, the family prepared to leave. The little girl ran back one final time. She gently touched one of the smooth river stones surrounding the emerald plant. "Bye. We'll come back." Then she skipped happily toward the gate. Her grandmother smiled warmly at Samuel. "I hope someone keeps taking care of this place." Samuel looked around the peaceful garden. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "it has been taking care of people all along." The woman nodded. "I believe you're right." Together, they watched the children disappear beneath the old oak trees. The garden grew wonderfully quiet once more. Samuel remained on the bench as golden afternoon light filtered gently through the leaves overhead. His thoughts wandered through the stories Elias had written. Children becoming parents. Parents becoming grandparents. Grandparents becoming cherished memories. Generation after generation. The garden had never hurried any of them. It simply welcomed each visitor exactly as they were. Happy, lonely, young, old, curious, tired. It made no difference. Everyone belonged beneath its branches. Samuel glanced toward the tiny sprout. Its two little leaves had turned gently toward the afternoon sun. It would take many years before it resembled its ancient parent. Perhaps many decades. Perhaps even centuries. The thought filled him with quiet hope. One day, children not yet born would stand where he was standing now. They would marvel at the same peaceful beauty. They would leave tiny gifts among the river stones. They would carry home a little more calm than they had brought with them. And maybe, without ever realizing why, they would tell their own grandchildren about a forgotten garden hidden beyond an old stone wall. As evening settled softly across the valley, the ancient plant stood peacefully beside its tiny offspring. One had watched 200 years pass. The other had only just greeted its first season. Between them rested every story the garden had ever quietly gathered. And somewhere beyond the western hills, another sunset slowly painted the sky. The kind of sunset the old plant had witnessed thousands of times before. Yet somehow, it still seemed just as beautiful as the very first. End of Chapter 8. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 9. The Keeper of Quiet Things. By now, Samuel no longer thought of himself as a visitor. Not exactly. Visitors arrived. Visitors admired. Visitors left. But every morning, as he walked the winding road toward the old stone wall, he felt something different. It was the pleasant feeling of returning. Returning to a place that never asked where he had been. Returning to a place that accepted every version of him. The busy professor he once was. The retired botanist he had become. The curious child he had quietly rediscovered somewhere along the way. The forgotten garden welcomed them all. The morning began with a gentle fog. Not the thick kind that hides the world, only enough to soften distant trees and blur the edges of the hills. The garden seemed wrapped inside a pale gray blanket. Spiderwebs shimmered like delicate necklaces strung between lavender stems. Tiny droplets rested on every blade of grass. Even the old greenhouse appeared dreamlike, its weathered glass glowing softly in the early light. Samuel paused at the gate before stepping inside. He had begun a small tradition. Every morning, he placed one hand on the cool iron gate and took a slow, grateful breath. Not because anyone had told him to, simply because the garden reminded him that beginning gently often made the whole day gentler. The robin greeted him first, for familiar notes floated from the highest branch of the old oak. Samuel looked up and smiled. "Good morning to you too." The bird tilted its head as though satisfied that Samuel had answered. Then it flew toward the emerald plant, landing gracefully on one of its broad leaves. The tiny sprout below seemed stronger today. Its stem stood straighter. Its leaves had grown just a little wider. Samuel knelt beside it. "You're taking your time." He nodded thoughtfully. That's probably the right way. He had spent most of his career watching plants grow. Yet somehow this little sprout felt different. He wasn't measuring its progress. He wasn't wondering how tall it might become. He simply enjoyed seeing it exactly as it was. After settling onto the familiar bench, Samuel reopened Elias Whitmore's journal. Only a few unread pages remained. The leather cover felt wonderfully smooth beneath his fingers after so many mornings of careful reading. One entry immediately caught his attention. Its title was unlike any before. "Things Worth Keeping." Samuel smiled. He turned the page. Instead of describing flowers or weather, Elias had written a simple list. Not objects, moments. The sound of rain arriving before sunrise. Fresh bread carried home while still warm. A child's first question about a butterfly. The smell of cedar after summer rain. Someone choosing kindness when no one is watching. A robin singing before the world wakes. An afternoon with no need to hurry. Samuel read each line slowly. There were dozens. Small moments. Ordinary moments. The kinds of moments most people forgot before bedtime. Yet Elias had carefully preserved them. Near the bottom of the page, another sentence appeared. "The emerald plant reminds me that the world is held together not by great events, but by quiet ones." Samuel rested the journal on his lap. Those words lingered in the stillness. He thought about newspapers, history books, television. People often remembered the loudest moments. Battles, storms, famous speeches, great inventions. But perhaps life itself was built from entirely different pieces. Morning coffee, neighbors waving, children laughing, someone holding a door open, a peaceful walk, a comfortable silence shared between friends. Perhaps those were the true foundations of a good life. The gentle sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. An elderly mail carrier entered the garden carrying an old leather satchel. He tipped his cap politely. "Morning." "Good morning," Samuel replied. "I've delivered mail around this town for nearly 40 years. The man smiled toward the emerald plant. "Figured I'd finally stop by." Samuel gestured toward the bench. "Please." The man sat. For several minutes they said nothing. The breeze spoke for them. Eventually the mail carrier chuckled. "You know, I've driven past this place thousands of times. I always thought I'd visit someday." Samuel nodded. "What kept you?" The man laughed softly. "Oh, I suppose I was always busy delivering everyone else's letters." Samuel looked toward the old greenhouse. "I've been reading letters written here 200 years ago." The mail carrier smiled. "Funny thing about letters. They're really just people trying to save a moment before it disappears. Samuel hadn't thought of it that way, but it felt exactly right. Before leaving, the mail carrier reached into his satchel. He pulled out a small polished river stone. I picked this up beside the creek years ago. It's been riding around with me ever since. He placed it gently beside the feather, the acorn, and the pine cone. Seems happier here. Samuel watched him walk slowly back toward town. Another quiet gift. Another quiet story. The circle around the ancient plant was slowly becoming a collection of kindness. Nothing expensive. Nothing valuable. Yet somehow priceless. That afternoon, clouds gathered across the valley. Not rain clouds. Soft white ones drifting lazily across a bright blue sky. Samuel wandered toward the greenhouse. Inside, sunlight filtered through old glass in beautiful patterns. He noticed something he hadn't seen before. On one wall hung a faded wooden shelf. Upon it rested dozens of tiny glass jars. Each held something simple. A feather, a maple seed, a pressed flower, a smooth shell. Tiny handwritten labels accompanied each one. Found by Lucy, spring 1888. Gift from a traveler, autumn 1912. Blue jay feather, first snow 1946. Samuel smiled warmly. The greenhouse wasn't merely storing botanical specimens. It was protecting memories. Each object represented an ordinary day that someone had decided was worth remembering. He thought again about Elias's list. Perhaps that had been the gardener's true work all along. Not growing plants, growing appreciation, helping people notice the quiet beauty that had always surrounded them. As evening approached, Samuel returned to the old bench one last time. The garden glowed beneath soft amber light. The robins sang. The fountain whispered. Leaves rustled gently overhead. He looked toward the ancient emerald plant. For days he had wondered why it seemed so different from every other plant. Now, for the first time, he wasn't searching for a scientific explanation. Instead, another thought quietly settled into his heart. Maybe the plant wasn't extraordinary because it had lived for 200 years. Maybe it had lived for 200 years because it had never stopped doing one simple thing. It remained. Steady through every season. Patient through every change. Quiet while the world hurried around it. Like a lighthouse that never chased ships. It simply stood where it belonged. And because it stood faithfully, people found their way back to themselves. Samuel smiled. I think I understand. The breeze gently stirred the emerald leaves. Whether it was agreement or simply evening wind didn't matter. Some answers felt complete without proof. As twilight deepened, he noticed the tiny sprout once more. Its leaves trembled softly beneath the cooling breeze. The ancient plant stood beside it, sheltering it from stronger gusts. Old protecting new. Without words, without effort, simply by standing close. Far above them, the first evening star appeared. It had watched generations look upward in wonder. Tonight was no different. Samuel quietly gathered his blanket and notebook. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise. Another peaceful walk. Another story. The garden had waited 2 centuries. It wasn't in any hurry. Neither, he realized, was he. End of Chapter 9. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 10. The long winter of silence. Autumn arrived so gently that no one in the little town could point to the exact day it began. Perhaps it was the first maple leaf that floated lazily onto Main Street. Perhaps it was the cool breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Or perhaps it was the bakery quietly replacing peach pies with warm apple cinnamon, filling the morning air with a fragrance that reminded everyone that another season had quietly taken its place. Samuel noticed the change not by looking, but by listening. The garden sounded different. The bees hummed less often. The crickets began their evening songs a little earlier. The robin's morning melody grew shorter, as if it, too, was preparing for the colder days ahead. Nature never rushed into a new season. It simply welcomed it. And somehow, that made every change feel less like an ending and more like a gentle invitation. Samuel arrived wearing his favorite wool sweater, the one his sister had knitted many Christmases ago. Its sleeves had stretched over the years, and one elbow had been carefully patched. He loved it even more because it wasn't perfect. The old iron gate greeted him with its familiar creak. "I've missed you," Samuel said with a smile. A cool breeze answered, carrying a handful of golden leaves across the stone path. The garden looked wonderfully different. The lavender had faded into soft shades of gray. The apple trees stood lighter now, their branches relieved of nearly all their fruit. Clusters of bright orange pumpkins had appeared beside the greenhouse, though Samuel couldn't imagine who had placed them there. Perhaps a neighbor. Perhaps someone who quietly loved the garden without needing recognition. The emerald plant remained unchanged. Its leaves were still richly green, untouched by autumn's golden paint. Beside it, the little sprout had grown several inches taller. Its tiny leaves still shimmered with faint silver veins whenever the morning light found them. Samuel knelt beside it. "You've done well." The little plant swayed almost imperceptibly. Whether from the breeze or something else, he no longer cared to decide. Over the following weeks, the days grew shorter. Sunlight lingered less each afternoon. The garden slowly prepared itself for winter. Flowers released their final seeds into the wind. Squirrels hurried busily between the oak trees, burying acorns in places they hoped to remember. The robin visited less often. One chilly morning, Samuel watched it land upon the ancient plant for several quiet moments before flying high into the southern sky. It circled the garden once, twice, then disappeared beyond the distant hills. Samuel lifted his hand in a quiet farewell. Safe travels. The garden seemed just a little quieter afterward. One afternoon, rain arrived. Not the gentle spring showers Samuel had come to love. This rain was colder, heavier. It drummed steadily upon the greenhouse roof. The old glass rattled softly. Water trickled between ancient stones before disappearing into the rich, dark soil. Samuel sat beneath the oak tree, wrapped comfortably in his sweater. The emerald plant welcomed every drop exactly as before. Its leaves shimmered gently. Silver veins glowed beneath the rain. For a brief moment, Samuel felt another memory brush quietly across his thoughts. Not a picture this time. A feeling. Warm bread cooling on a wooden windowsill. A crackling fireplace. Someone humming a lullaby while rain tapped softly against old glass. The feeling lingered only a heartbeat before fading. Samuel smiled. The memories the plant shared were never loud. They arrived the way snowflakes do, one at a time, soft enough that many people might never notice them. By early November, frost painted the garden each morning. Every blade of grass sparkled beneath delicate crystals. The fountain finally grew quiet. Its gentle trickle slowed, then stopped altogether. Thin ice formed around its edges. Samuel placed his gloved hand against the stone. "So we'll rest for a while." The garden seemed to understand. Nothing in nature feared winter. Trees didn't worry about losing leaves. Flowers didn't mourn their fading blossoms. They simply trusted spring enough to let go. Samuel wondered why people found that so difficult. One cloudy afternoon, he returned to the greenhouse and opened Elias Whitmore's journal. Near the final pages, one entry stood alone. No date, only a title. Winter. The handwriting appeared older than before. Slower, gentler. Samuel began reading. Many people believe the garden sleeps during winter. They are mistaken. Winter is not sleep. It is listening. Samuel paused. Outside, snowflakes had begun drifting past the greenhouse windows. The first snowfall of the season. Each flake floated lazily through the still air before settling quietly upon the garden. He continued reading. Nothing grows loudly beneath the snow. Roots continue their patient work. Seeds gather strength. The earth remembers every promise spring has ever made. Samuel looked through the old glass. The emerald plant stood beneath the falling snow. Its broad leaves gradually disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Beside it, the little sprout became almost invisible. Only the faintest tip remained above the snowdrift. Yet somehow, Samuel wasn't worried. The plant had survived 200 winters. The little one had learned from the very best teacher. Over the next several days, the valley transformed completely. The winding road disappeared beneath fresh snow. The old stone wall wore a soft white cap. Icicles hung from the greenhouse roof like tiny crystal chimes. Every sound became quieter. Footsteps softened. Birdsong faded. Even the wind seemed to whisper instead of speak. Samuel visited whenever the roads allowed. Sometimes he stayed only a few minutes. Sometimes an hour. He brushed heavy snow from the greenhouse roof. He checked that the old gate still opened. He gently cleared snow from the circular flower bed, leaving just enough to protect the roots beneath. The garden gave him no instructions. He simply helped where he could. Friendship often looked exactly like that. One evening, as twilight settled over the snowy valley, Samuel stood beside the emerald plant. Everything around him was silent. No insects, no birds, no flowing fountain. Only the slow drift of snowflakes through the fading light. He suddenly realized something remarkable. Silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of waiting. Full of quiet hope. Full of things preparing themselves for another beginning. He remembered the words Elias had written. Winter is listening. Samuel closed his eyes. He listened. To the gentle whisper of falling snow. To his own steady breathing. To the peaceful stillness surrounding him. For the first time in many years, silence no longer felt lonely. It felt like company. When he opened his eyes again, the first evening star shone above the snowy oak trees. The ancient plant stood quietly beneath its blanket of white. The tiny sprout rested safely beside it. Neither hurried toward spring. Neither feared the cold. Both trusted the seasons. And as Samuel walked slowly back toward the old iron gate, his footprints becoming the only marks upon the fresh snow, he couldn't help but feel that the garden had taught him something far greater than the secret of a 200-year-old plant. It had taught him that life wasn't measured only by the seasons of growth. Sometimes, the most important season was the quiet one, the season when nothing seemed to happen. Because beneath the snow, hidden from every eye, tomorrow was already preparing itself. End of Chapter 10. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 11. A seed carried across the ocean. Winter settled comfortably over the valley. Not with fierce blizzards or bitter winds, but with the gentle confidence of a season that knew exactly what it was meant to do. Snow rested quietly on rooftops. The old stone wall became a long white ribbon stretching beside the country road. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys each evening, carrying the comforting scent of burning oak into the crisp air. The town itself seemed to breathe more slowly. People lingered longer over hot coffee. Neighbors paused to chat while shoveling sidewalks. Children bundled in colorful scarves built snowmen that stood proudly until the next gentle snowfall reshaped them. Everything had become quieter. Everything except Samuel's curiosity. Although deep snow covered most of the garden, Samuel continued visiting whenever the weather allowed. He never stayed very long. Winter belonged to the garden now. His role was simply to check that everything remained safe. One bright afternoon, after brushing a layer of snow from the greenhouse roof, he noticed something he had overlooked for weeks. Behind the old work table stood a narrow staircase. It disappeared into a small loft tucked beneath the greenhouse roof. The steps were steep but sturdy. Their polished edges suggested that countless careful feet had climbed them over many decades. Samuel smiled. "I wonder what you've been hiding." The staircase creaked gently beneath his weight. Not in protest, almost like laughter. At the top waited a tiny room no larger than a bedroom. A single round window overlooked the snow-covered garden. Dust floated lazily through pale winter sunlight. Against one wall stood a small writing desk. Beside it rested a rocking chair whose curved runners had smoothed with generations of quiet evenings. Samuel imagined Elias Whitmore sitting there during snowy afternoons, writing while the garden rested beneath blankets of white. The thought made the room feel unexpectedly warm. The desk contained only a few simple belongings. A dried sprig of lavender, an ink bottle that had long since emptied, a magnifying lens, and beneath the lowest drawer, a flat wooden box. Unlike the cedar box that held Elias's letters, this one had been carefully sealed with beeswax. Samuel gently loosened the lid. Inside rested a bundle of folded papers tied with faded blue ribbon. The top page read simply, "For whoever loves this garden enough to wonder." Samuel laughed softly. It seems Elias knew curiosity very well. He untied the ribbon. The first page wasn't a letter. It was a map, hand-drawn with remarkable care. Its edges had yellowed with time, but every line remained clear. The map showed the Atlantic Ocean, the eastern coast of North America. Then, stretching across the sea, a dotted line. It traveled toward Europe, across mountains, through forests, until finally ending at a tiny drawing of a stone monastery perched high upon a hillside. Beside it, Elias had written, "This is where the old traveler claimed the seed began its journey." Samuel unfolded another page. This one was a story, not written like science, written like memory. The traveler arrived one rainy evening in the spring of 1826. His boots were worn. His coat had been mended many times. Yet he smiled as though every mile had been worth walking. Samuel could almost picture him, an older man carrying little more than a walking stick and a leather satchel. Perhaps he had crossed villages, climbed mountains, and sailed across oceans simply because he believed one tiny seed deserved another chance to grow. The story continued. He spoke with a gentle accent I could not place. When asked where he had come from, he simply answered, "From wherever the wind believed I should be." Samuel smiled. That sounded exactly like the sort of answer travelers sometimes gave after spending too many years on the road. The next pages described the mysterious seed itself. He carried it inside a small linen pouch stitched by his grandmother. He told me it came from a plant older than anyone in his village could remember. Each generation had cared for it without ever claiming ownership. They believed no one truly owned such a plant. People simply borrowed its company for a little while. Samuel paused. Borrowed its company. What a beautiful way to think about the natural world. Not something to possess. Something to appreciate while it quietly shared time with you. Outside the round window, snowflakes drifted lazily toward the garden. Samuel continued reading. Before leaving, the traveler handed me the seed. I protested. Surely something so precious should remain with him. He laughed kindly. Nothing grows by staying in one pocket forever. Seeds travel. That is their purpose. Samuel looked down at his hands. How many journeys had begun with something almost impossibly small? An acorn becoming an oak. A single letter becoming a lifelong friendship. A quiet conversation changing someone's heart. Perhaps the greatest stories always began that way. The final pages described planting day, April 18th, 1827. The soil was cool after gentle rain. Bluebirds nested nearby. A young maple tree stood only shoulder high. I planted the seed at sunrise. Then I waited. Samuel laughed. That final sentence somehow felt perfect. Not, then something extraordinary happened. Simply, then I waited. Nature had always preferred patience over excitement. He carefully returned the papers to their box. As he closed the lid, something small rolled gently against the wood. A tiny linen pouch. Samuel picked it up. It was wonderfully soft despite its age. Inside, there was only one thing. Another seed. Smaller than a sunflower seed. Smoother than an acorn. Its surface shimmered faintly with tiny silver lines. Samuel stared silently. He immediately understood. This wasn't meant for collecting, or selling, or locking away in a museum. It was simply waiting, exactly as the first seed once had. He carried the little pouch downstairs. The greenhouse felt warmer somehow. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Winter sunlight spread gently across the quiet garden. Samuel walked to the circular flower bed. The ancient plant rested peacefully beneath its blanket of snow. Beside it, hidden safely below the surface, the young sprout waited for spring. Samuel held the little pouch carefully. "I don't think today is your day." He smiled. "And that's perfectly all right." Instead of planting it, he returned the seed to its box upstairs. Some things revealed their purpose only when the season was right. Trying to hurry them only meant missing the lesson. As afternoon slowly faded into the soft blue light of winter evening, Samuel stood beside the old greenhouse window. The garden looked almost untouched. Pure, peaceful, timeless. He imagined the traveler crossing the ocean 2 centuries earlier, perhaps sailing aboard a wooden ship that creaked with every wave, perhaps protecting that tiny seed through storms, cold nights, and endless miles of open water. Not because he expected recognition, simply because he believed beautiful things should continue, even if he never saw the ending of the story himself. Samuel realized something that filled him with quiet gratitude. Every generation had become only one chapter. The traveler, Elias Whitmore, Margaret, the families who visited, the little girl with the acorn, the mail carrier with the polished stone, and now, him. None of them owned the garden. They had simply cared for it during the brief season they were given. Outside, the first evening star appeared above the snowy hills. The ancient emerald plant stood quietly beneath the fading sky, patient as always. Its story had crossed an ocean. Its roots had reached through centuries. And somewhere, hidden beneath the stillness of winter, another chapter was already preparing to bloom when spring returned. End of chapter 11. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 12. When the garden bloomed once more. Winter, no matter how long it lingered, always carried a quiet promise. Some mornings it hid beneath layers of snow. Some afternoons it whispered from icy branches. But deep beneath the frozen earth, where no eye could see, spring was already preparing its gentle return. The garden knew this. The trees knew this. Even the smallest sleeping seeds knew this. Only people sometimes forgot. One morning, Samuel noticed the first unmistakable sign. It wasn't a flower. It wasn't a bird. It was the sound of water. As he approached the old stone wall, he heard a familiar trickling beneath the silence. The narrow stream beside the garden had begun to move again. Small patches of ice drifted lazily downstream, turning slowly in the gentle current before disappearing around the bend. Winter had loosened its grip. Not all at once. Just enough. Samuel smiled to himself. Welcome back. The words were meant for the stream, but somehow they felt meant for the whole world. The old iron gate opened with its familiar creak. The garden looked wonderfully sleepy. Snow still rested in shaded corners beneath the oaks, but sunlight had begun reclaiming the flower beds. Tiny green shoots pushed bravely through the damp earth. The fountain whispered once more, its water sparkling in the cool morning light. Everything smelled different. Fresh soil, wet cedar, new grass, the unmistakable scent of another beginning. Samuel took a deep breath. He had always believed spring had its own perfume. Nothing bottled in a shop could ever capture it. The emerald plant stood exactly where it always had. Its leaves looked as healthy as ever, untouched by the long winter. Beside it, the young sprout had changed in remarkable ways. Now nearly a foot tall, it had grown several graceful branches. Each carried bright emerald leaves lined with delicate silver veins. The little plant no longer seemed fragile. It had survived its first winter. Samuel crouched beside it with a warm smile. You've earned your spring. A gentle breeze brushed through both plants at once. Their leaves rustled together. Old and young, teacher and student, parent and child. The sound blended so perfectly that Samuel couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The robin returned 3 mornings later. Samuel heard the familiar 4-note melody before he ever saw the bird. He looked upward. There you are. The robin landed exactly where generations before it always had, on the broad lower branch of the ancient plant. Only this time, it wasn't alone. 3 younger robins followed behind. They fluttered awkwardly among the branches, still learning confidence. The older robin hopped gracefully from leaf to leaf before flying toward the old oak. One by one, the younger birds copied the journey. Samuel laughed softly. Some traditions don't need words. Within days, the garden awakened completely. Bluebells painted patches of ground in shades of violet. Daffodils nodded cheerfully beside the pathways. Wild strawberries spread tiny white blossoms beneath the apple trees. Butterflies drifted through warm afternoon air as though they had never been away. The bees returned too. Their steady humming filled the garden with one of nature's oldest songs. Samuel sat quietly on the familiar bench. He closed his eyes. The sound reminded him of summer afternoons from his childhood, when time seemed endless, when worries belonged only to grown-ups, when the world felt wonderfully simple. Visitors slowly began returning. Not crowds. The garden had never wanted crowds. Just a few people each week. A young couple carrying a picnic basket. A father teaching his son the names of spring wildflowers. An elderly woman who spent an hour sketching tulips without speaking to anyone. Everyone seemed to leave more slowly than they had arrived. The garden had a way of encouraging unhurried footsteps. One Saturday morning, Samuel noticed something delightful. The little girl with the yellow rain boots had returned. This time she wasn't wearing boots at all. Spring had arrived. Instead, she wore a bright blue sun hat decorated with tiny embroidered daisies. She ran happily toward the circular flower bed. It's bigger. She pointed excitedly at the young plant. Her grandfather laughed. So it is. I told you it would grow. The little girl crouched beside it. It had a good nap. Samuel couldn't help smiling. Children explained nature better than textbooks sometimes did. The plant hadn't battled winter. It had rested, just as it needed to. Her grandfather carried a small paper bag. I brought something. He carefully scattered a handful of wildflower seeds along the edge of the garden. "Native flowers," he explained. "My wife loved planting these." Samuel watched quietly. No one asked permission. The gesture somehow felt perfectly right. The garden had always welcomed thoughtful gifts. The little girl reached into her pocket. Instead of another pine cone or acorn, she carefully unfolded a tiny drawing. Crayon flowers, a bright yellow sun, a smiling tree, and in the center, a large green plant with silver lines on every leaf. "I made this for the garden." Samuel accepted the drawing gently. "It's beautiful. Can it stay here?" He thought for only a moment. "I believe it should." Together they placed the picture inside the greenhouse beneath a small pane of glass where the breeze couldn't carry it away. The drawing looked wonderfully at home among Elias Whitmore's sketches. Nearly 200 years separated the artists. Yet somehow, they had drawn the same feeling. Later that afternoon, Samuel opened the old journal once more. One blank page remained. Only one. He picked up Elias's fountain pen. Remarkably, it still wrote after he had carefully filled it with fresh ink. For a long time, he simply looked at the empty page. Then he began writing. Spring returned once again. The robin found its branch. Children found wonder. The young plant greeted its first full season. The garden continues doing what it has always done. He paused, smiling, then finished the sentence. It quietly reminds people that beautiful things require patience. Samuel gently closed the journal. The story didn't truly end there. There simply wasn't another blank page. Life, he realized, never asked permission to continue. As evening approached, golden sunlight poured across the flower beds. The greenhouse windows reflected warm shades of amber and rose. The ancient plant glowed softly beneath the fading light. Beside it, the young plant shimmered with youthful brightness. Samuel suddenly noticed that visitors had left even more small treasures around the circle of smooth stones. A tiny seashell, a smooth piece of driftwood, a pressed clover, a hand-carved wooden bird. No one had signed their gifts. They didn't need to. Kindness rarely asked for recognition. The garden accepted each offering with equal gratitude. As the first stars appeared overhead, Samuel remained on the old bench a little longer than usual. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs through the valley. Somewhere nearby, frogs began their gentle chorus beside the stream. The robin sang its familiar 4 notes before settling into the oak for the night. Samuel looked around the peaceful garden. Nothing here demanded attention. Nothing competed to be the loudest. Yet somehow, everything mattered. Every blossom, every visitor, every quiet conversation, every season, every simple act of kindness. The garden had never tried to change the world. It simply changed the hearts of the people who wandered through it. And perhaps that was enough. As darkness settled gently over the valley, the 2 emerald plants stood together beneath the stars. One carried 2 centuries of memories. The other carried 2 centuries of hope waiting to become memories of its own. Neither knew how many springs still lay ahead. Neither needed to know. Tonight, it was enough simply to stand beneath the stars, growing quietly, together. End of Chapter 12. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 13. The secret hidden beneath the roots. Spring slowly gave way to early summer. The days stretched a little longer. The evenings lingered a little softer, and the forgotten garden seemed to breathe with an easy confidence, as though it had settled into its favorite season. The roses climbed higher along the old stone walls. The lavender swayed like gentle purple waves whenever the afternoon breeze wandered through. The apple trees, once covered with blossoms, now carried tiny green fruit that promised sweet autumn harvests. Samuel noticed that every week brought some small surprise. A flower blooming where none had grown before. A family of rabbits appearing beneath the cedar hedge. A dragonfly resting on the fountain's edge just long enough for the sunlight to catch its delicate wings. The garden never repeated itself. It simply whispered new details to anyone patient enough to notice. One bright morning, Samuel arrived carrying something unusual. Not a notebook, not a basket. Instead, he carried a small wooden wind chime he had found at a local craft fair. It wasn't polished or expensive. 5 slender cedar tubes hung from a simple piece of driftwood. The craftsman had carved tiny oak leaves along the top. Samuel walked around the garden for several minutes before deciding where it belonged. Finally, he found an old maple branch overlooking the greenhouse. He tied the wind chime carefully. A gentle breeze arrived almost immediately, as though curious. The cedar tubes touched one another with the softest melody. Not loud, not demanding, just enough to blend with the birds and the rustling leaves. Samuel smiled. It sounds like the garden was expecting you. The weeks passed peacefully. Visitors came and went. Some stayed only a few minutes. Others remained until sunset. Each seemed to leave behind something invisible. A lighter heart, a slower step, a quieter mind. Samuel often thought about Elias Whitmore's words. The world is held together not by great events, but by quiet ones. The more time he spent in the garden, the more those words felt true. One afternoon, while gently clearing weeds from the edge of the circular flower bed, Samuel noticed something unusual. One of the smooth river stones had shifted slightly after a recent rain. Beneath it appeared the corner of something flat. At first he assumed it was another ordinary rock. But as he brushed away damp soil with his fingers, warm sunlight reflected faintly from polished wood. Curiosity stirred. He carefully lifted the stone. Buried just beneath the surface rested a small wooden lid. Time had darkened the oak almost black. Tiny roots wrapped gently around its edges, as though protecting it rather than trapping it. Samuel paused. He had learned something from the garden. Nothing important should ever be opened in a hurry. He spent nearly half an hour gently loosening the surrounding soil without disturbing the roots. When the little box finally lifted free, he noticed something remarkable. The roots of the ancient emerald plant hadn't grown through it. They had curved around it, like careful hands making space, almost as though the plant itself had been quietly guarding whatever rested inside. The box was surprisingly light. Its brass latch had long since turned green with age. Samuel carried it beneath the old oak tree before opening it. Inside lay no treasure, no gold, no jewels, only a bundle of carefully folded papers wrapped inside soft linen. Beside them rested a small glass bottle. The bottle contained clear water, perfectly still, perfectly transparent. A handwritten label had been tied around its neck. It simply read, "First rain." Samuel frowned gently. First rain. He untied the papers. The top sheet wasn't written by Elias Whitmore. The handwriting was older, more delicate. At the bottom appeared only a name. Annalise. No last name. No date. He began reading. "If you have found this, then the garden has decided it is time. Do not search for magic here. You will not find any. The greatest mistake people make is believing that wonder must always be supernatural." Samuel smiled. Already, he liked the writer. He continued, "This plant has never healed the sick. It has never granted wishes. It has never spoken aloud. Yet people continue calling it miraculous. They misunderstand." Samuel leaned back against the oak. A breeze gently stirred the wind chime overhead. Its soft melody accompanied the words. "The plant does only one remarkable thing. It remembers peace. Samuel stopped reading. The sentence settled quietly into the afternoon. He looked toward the emerald leaves shimmering softly in the sunlight. Remembers peace. He read on. Every peaceful afternoon. Every gentle conversation. Every act of kindness. Every child who laughed beneath its branches. Every weary traveler who finally rested. Every quiet promise kept. The plant remembers. Samuel's eyes slowly lifted from the page. He thought of the little girl's drawing, the mail carrier's polished stone, the grandmother's stories, the robin's generations, the feather, the pine cone, the music box, the list Elias had written. Perhaps none of those moments had ever truly disappeared. The letter continued. Nature keeps records differently than people. Trees record years inside their rings. Rivers remember mountains. Stars remember ancient light. And this plant remembers moments of peace. That is why visitors often leave lighter than they arrived. Not because something has been taken away, but because they have been quietly reminded of the peace that already lived inside them. Samuel closed his eyes. Suddenly, everything made sense. The memories during rainfall, the calm everyone described, the feeling that time slowed inside the garden. The plant wasn't creating peace. It was reflecting it, the way a still pond reflects the sky. He carefully opened the little glass bottle. Inside, the water looked completely ordinary. There was no fragrance, no unusual color. Another folded note rested beneath it, collected from the first spring rain after the seed was planted. Not because the water is special, because remembering is. Samuel smiled warmly. Even this wasn't magic. It was gratitude. Someone had simply wished to remember the beginning. Late that afternoon, visitors began arriving as they often did. A retired schoolteacher carrying a novel. 2 cyclists resting beneath the oak. A young mother pushing a stroller. None of them knew about the little box. None of them needed to. The secret wasn't something to announce. It wasn't even really a secret. It was a truth people often forgot. Peace could be practiced. Kindness could be remembered. Quiet moments could become lifelong treasures if someone simply noticed them. Samuel carefully returned the letters to the wooden box. He placed the bottle beside them. Then, with great care, he buried everything exactly where he had found it. The roots gently settled back into place. The smooth river stone returned to its spot. Nothing looked disturbed. Some stories belonged to the earth. As sunset painted the garden in shades of gold and amber, Samuel sat on the old bench. The wind chimes sang softly. The fountain whispered. The robin's descendants settled into the oak. The young emerald plant shimmered beside its ancient parent. Samuel looked around slowly. The forgotten garden wasn't preserving history. It wasn't protecting a miracle. It was quietly teaching something the world often rushed past. That the richest lives were rarely built from extraordinary moments. They were built from ordinary ones. Loved deeply. As twilight settled over the valley, the ancient plant stood peacefully beneath the evening sky. Its roots reached deep into the earth. Its leaves reached gently toward the fading light. Between them, held safely through 200 years, lived thousands of tiny moments that had made ordinary people feel wonderfully, beautifully at home. And perhaps that had been the greatest secret all along. End of chapter 13. A cozy bedtime story. The plant that lived for 200 years. Chapter 14. The final bloom. Summer settled over the valley like a favorite quilt. Not too warm, not too cool. Just the kind of gentle season that invited people to leave their windows open at night and listen to crickets singing beneath the stars. The forgotten garden seemed happier than ever. The fountain sparkled beneath bright blue skies. Butterflies drifted lazily from blossom to blossom without appearing to have any destination at all. The lavender had reached its fullest bloom, filling the air with a fragrance so calming that visitors often paused before they realized why. Samuel had stopped counting the days. The calendar still rested inside his room above the bakery. But here, among the old stone paths and whispering trees, days were measured differently. By sunrise, by birdsong, by blooming flowers, by quiet conversations shared on weathered benches. Life felt wonderfully simple. One early morning, before the town had fully awakened, Samuel arrived carrying only his old straw hat. The air was unusually still. Even the wind seemed to be sleeping. As he stepped through the familiar iron gate, something immediately caught his attention. The emerald plant looked different. Not unhealthy, not weaker, simply different. Its leaves seemed brighter than he had ever seen them. Tiny silver veins shimmered gently beneath the morning sunlight. The young plant beside it also seemed unusually vibrant, its leaves standing tall as though greeting the new day. Samuel slowly approached. He knelt quietly beside the ancient plant. Then he saw it. Near the very center, where broad emerald leaves met the sturdy stem, a small green bud had appeared. No larger than the tip of his thumb, perfectly round, covered in tiny silver lines. Samuel stared without speaking. He had spent months observing the ancient plant. He had never seen a flower, never found a seed pod, never discovered even the smallest blossom. Yet here, after 2 centuries, there was a bud. He laughed softly. "Well, you've been keeping another secret," the breeze answered with its familiar whisper. Samuel reached for his notebook, but after opening it, he simply closed it again. Some moments deserved full attention instead of careful documentation. He settled onto the old bench and watched. Nothing happened. Of course it didn't. Nature had never performed for audiences. Word spread quietly through the little town. Not through newspapers, not on television, simply through conversations. The old garden has something new. Within a few days, familiar faces began stopping by once again. The grandmother returned with her grandchildren. The retired mail carrier came carrying fresh peaches from his backyard tree. The little girl in the blue sun hat now carried a tiny watering can. Not because the garden needed help, because she wanted to feel included. Samuel smiled as she carefully watered nearby wildflowers. "Not the big plant?" he asked. She shook her head. "It already knows how." Children often understood confidence better than adults. Each morning, the bud grew slightly larger. Not dramatically, only enough that someone paying close attention would notice. Its surface gradually changed from deep green to soft ivory. Delicate silver threads wrapped gently around its petals like tiny ribbons of moonlight. Visitors gathered quietly. No one crowded. No one spoke loudly. People simply sat. They read books, shared sandwiches, watched butterflies. The garden had not become famous. It had simply become appreciated. There was a difference. One warm evening, Samuel remained after sunset. The moon rose slowly above the eastern hills. Fireflies drifted through the flower beds. The old wind chime offered its gentle wooden melody whenever the breeze wandered past. The bud glowed softly beneath the moonlight, not with magic, simply with the beautiful brightness that pale flowers often borrowed from the moon. Samuel remembered the first night he had stayed in the garden. How uncertain everything had felt. How many questions he had carried. Now, he realized he no longer needed answers. The questions themselves had become peaceful companions. 3 mornings later, something extraordinary happened. Samuel arrived just before sunrise. The eastern sky glowed with gentle shades of peach and gold. Birdsong filled the valley. The robin sang its familiar 4 notes from the old oak. Then, very slowly, the bud began to open. Not all at once. One petal, then another. Each unfolded with remarkable patience. Samuel hardly breathed. The flower was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its petals were creamy white with the faintest hint of pale green near their centers. Fine silver veins traced elegant patterns across every petal. At its heart rested tiny golden stamens that shimmered gently in the morning light. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a teacup. Its beauty came not from extravagance, but from quiet perfection. A fragrance drifted softly through the garden. Not sweet, not strong. It smelled like spring rain, fresh linen, warm cedar, and distant memories that somehow made people smile without knowing why. Visitors who happened to be there stopped speaking, not because anyone asked them to, because silence seemed the most respectful response. The little girl looked up at Samuel. It waited a really long time. He nodded. Yes. Do you think it was lonely? Samuel thought carefully, then smiled. I don't think so. Why? Because every year someone came. The little girl looked around the garden. At the grandmother, the mail carrier, the cyclists, the baker, the children chasing butterflies, the old greenhouse, the oak trees. She smiled. So it had friends. Samuel laughed gently. I believe it always did. For the next several days, the flower remained open. Butterflies visited. Bees approached quietly. Even the robin landed nearby each morning before beginning its daily song. People continued arriving. No one picked the blossom. No one touched it. Everyone understood without needing to be told. Some beautiful things became more meaningful simply by letting them remain where they belonged. On the 7th morning, Samuel noticed the petals beginning to curl gently inward. The flower wasn't fading sadly. It was finishing gracefully, just as sunsets did, just as seasons did, just as every wonderful afternoon eventually became evening. He sat quietly beside the ancient plant. The breeze moved softly through the leaves. The wind chime answered. The fountain whispered nearby. Samuel found himself smiling instead of feeling sorrow. Nothing beautiful lasted forever. Perhaps that was exactly what made beauty precious. As the final petal drifted gently onto the circle of smooth river stones, something unexpected caught the morning sunlight. Where the flower had once rested, a tiny seed pod had appeared. Small, simple, almost ordinary. Samuel looked toward the young emerald plant growing beside its ancient parent, then toward the distant hills beyond the garden. He remembered the traveler crossing the ocean with a single seed carried inside a linen pouch. One small beginning, leading quietly to another. The story had never truly been about a flower, or a remarkable plant, or even a forgotten garden. It had always been about continuity, about caring for something beautiful long enough that someone else could one day enjoy it too. The ancient plant stood peacefully beneath the bright summer sky. Its first blossom in 200 years had come and gone without fanfare, without celebration, without asking the world to notice. And somehow, that made it even more beautiful. As evening settled gently across the valley, Samuel watched the tiny seed pod sway softly in the breeze. He had a feeling it wasn't the end of the story. It was simply another beginning, waiting patiently for the right season.